Golden Sun is the thrilling predecessor to Mario Tennis Power Tour, and like most RPGs, you gain a number of characters over the course of the game. By the end of the game, you've got 4 characters to work with, but there's also a 5th party member named Jenna, who joins you temporarily for the game's first dungeon before leaving for the entire rest of the game. Jenna is a main party member in the second game, but in this game, she's an incomplete character that's only designed to be used as a guest character in the first dungeon. But using glitches, you can actually get her back into your party after she leaves, and because she's not designed to be used outside of the first dungeon, this has a number of strange effects on the game. This got me curious, and so I decided to do the opposite of what the game expects. Rather than having Jenna be the only character you can't use, is it possible to complete a solo run of the game where you exclusively use Jenna? In this video I'm gonna find out. Here are the rules I used. First, the obvious main rule is that I have to play the game as Jenna solo. You need to make a little bit of progress into the game before you can do the glitch to have her join your party. It's not too much though, you only need to fight one mini-boss and no main bosses before you can get her. I decided to use Jenna solo in the first dungeon where you're supposed to have her, then use Garrett solo until the point where I could pull off the glitch, and then play through the rest of the game using Jenna solo once I got her. There is one point where I'll have to make an exception to this rule, but I'll get into that later on. Second, using other characters' overworld synergy is okay, but I can't use their healing synergy. Golden Sun has a lot of puzzles that require you to use spells in the overworld to solve them, and Jenna doesn't get any of those. You can use a character's synergy even if they're defeated, so I didn't need to revive them to do this, but I just thought it was worth clarifying. Also, this isn't a rule, but just to clarify in case anyone's confused, Isaac is always the character you control on the overworld, regardless of your party's order and who's alive. You can just imagine he's carrying Jenna around in a bag, Scott Pilgrim style. Those are the only rules. As long as I'm using Jenna by herself once she joins the party, then everything's fair game. So, let's get started. The game began with Isaac and Garrett enjoying a quiet, rainy day. During this intro, you only have Isaac and Garrett, but you can just run away from the handful of enemy encounters. After the intro is done, there's a time skip to 3 years later, and this cutscene plays. The cutscene ends with Garrett and Jenna joining your party. Keep this cutscene in mind for later. In the first dungeon, since Jenna is actually in your party legitimately, I got Isaac and Garrett defeated so I could play solo as her. Despite it being the first dungeon, this was actually more of a challenge than I expected already. The enemies here are usually quite easy, but with only Jenna alive, all attacks were directed at her, and it took longer to defeat each enemy. Fleeing was also harder with only one character, and in fact, when I first tried to get Isaac and Garrett defeated, Jenna actually ended up dying shortly after. When the entire party goes down, Isaac is revived at 1 HP, so I revived Jenna at the Sanctum, and then it was easy to get Isaac defeated again. I gave Isaac's sword to Jenna for a slight attack boost, and put the entire party's herbs onto her. Doing it solo like this ended up providing a fairly entertaining challenge right from the get-go. Every encounter had a very real chance of taking me down, and I ended up saving the game frequently so I could reset the game if I died, so I wouldn't lose the progress I'd made, and could conserve the herbs. The dungeon isn't that long though, so I got through it fairly quickly. Jenna got kidnapped, and after a chance encounter with Mike Wazowski, the journey began. Outside of town, I got my first Djinn. These can be equipped to give your stats a little boost, and equipping certain combinations of them will change a character's class and give them new abilities. You can also use them in battles, which unequips them but activates a special move. And if you've got enough Djinn unequipped, you can perform summons, which do a ton of damage. This is another mechanic that's going to be interesting to keep in mind for later. And with that, I set off. I killed off Isaac and soloed the first bit of the game as Garrett. I mentioned in the rules that I did this to preserve the solo nature of the challenge until I got Jenna, but there's actually another reason why this was important. In order for the glitch that gets you Jenna to work, Isaac actually needs to be kept at level 10 or below. So going as Garrett solo let me preserve the solo nature of the challenge, while also letting me keep Isaac's level at 1. I also went out of my way to do the minimum battles possible until I got Jenna, so I couldn't grind for a bunch of money now to make things easier for when I got her. To do the glitch to get Jenna, I had to get to Kolyma Forest, and to get there, I had to complete the story in the town of Vault first. Ivan joins the party, and there's a mini-boss fight here against 3 bandits. This is the only boss fight you have to do until you can get Jenna. You're not allowed to take Ivan outside of town until you finish the story here, which meant that he always started the battle at full HP. But if you lose the fight on purpose once, you can get sent to the Sanctum with Isaac at 1 HP. So then I could revive Garrett, and Isaac would only need to take 1 hit to make it a solo Garrett battle. The fight itself was actually fairly challenging. The bandits have a few herbs among them, and they'll use them to heal their HP for the first few attacks they take. There were also 3 enemies, which meant that when they all attacked, Garrett took a lot of damage. They can choose not to attack, which made things easier at times, but I never really felt safe. I tried the fight for over an hour and couldn't do it, so I decided to stock up on items and equipment. I upgraded Garrett's gear to the best the town had available, and gave him 30 herbs, which is the max amount of a single item a character can hold at once. For reasons you'll see a little later on, I was trying to save my money for when I got Jenna, but money wouldn't matter if I couldn't get to her in the first place. To defeat them, I kept an eye on Garrett's HP. These guys were unpredictable, because on some turns none of them would attack, and on other turns they'd all attack and obliterate Garrett's HP. I decided that if Garrett's HP fell below 40, I'd heal him every time without question. Garrett's max HP was 49, so just about every attack took him below 40, but on the few occasions where he got knocked down to 40 HP exactly, or when the enemies didn't attack, I'd use that opening to do an attack of my own. Once I defeated the first enemy, I decided to heal Garrett when he was below 35 HP instead. But then he took a hit that knocked him down to 1 HP, so I said screw that and stuck to healing below 40 HP no matter how many enemies were left. This was slow, but eventually did the trick. I used 29 herbs though, and since a single character can only hold 30 copies of a single item, I figured that, down the line, I'd probably want to find as many different kinds of healing items as possible, and as many copies of each as possible. With that done, it was time to get Jenna. After completing the storyline in Vault and getting Ivan by Goma Cave, I backtracked a bit to grab all of the permanent stat boosting items that were currently available, and then progressed until I reached Kalima Forest. Along the way, I made use of a cool technique by saving and resetting the game. The game's RNG, which is essentially how it determines what happens in luck-based situations, is actually very easy to manipulate. If you hold down A, B, start, and select, you can do what's called a soft reset, but if you turn the console on and off, or reset the game from the system menu in modern re-releases, you do a hard reset. The game has 2 RNG values, and both get reset to 0 if you do a hard reset. And, conveniently, as a result of this, when I load my file after a hard reset, the first random encounter always starts with a party advantage, which gives me a free turn, so I could flee from the first random encounter guaranteed. I could just repeat this process to push forward risk-free. Once I reached the forest, I headed for Tret Tree. This dungeon leads to one of the game's first major bosses, but more importantly, it's also the location where I can finally pull off the glitch to get Jenna. Before I get started with the explanation, I want to give a thank you to TL Plexa, Conical Flak, Dairati, FX, Rafi, AKD, Zadetta656, Salanute, Drifting Pancake, and Ree from the Golden Sun speedrunning community. They helped explain a lot of tricks and mechanics over the course of the playthrough, and this video probably only came together thanks to their help. I started by climbing up to floor 2. This floor has these leaf tiles that you can hop onto. Hopping onto a leaf tile once cracks it, and hopping on a second time breaks it and makes you fall through. I headed outside to the left, then cast move using Isaac repeatedly until his PP was below 6. Then I opened up the Synergy menu. You can set overworld spells to the L and R buttons to use them as shortcuts. I set the retreat spell to a shortcut, and then attempted to cast it. Since Isaac didn't have enough PP to use it, the spell failed. But this actually has some weird effects. I saved the game and reset, and Isaac was now out of bounds inside the tree. From here, I had to take a bunch of weird and precise steps. Also, I initially tried this with Isaac and Ivan defeated, but fleeing from battles as Garrett solo was too hard, so I eventually went back and revived them to make the trick easier to do. I held up right until I was in this corner. Then I listened to the game's music. In order to do this trick, you have to travel off-screen far out of bounds, so you can't actually see what you're doing. The song that plays in this area has a specific instrument that plays at a consistent beat. So, you can time your movements with this beat to get into the right positions. So here are the steps I had to take. I held up left for 20 of these notes, then right for 1 note, and then up for 4 notes. I saved the game and reset. Then, from the main menu, instead of loading the file normally, I went into the battle mode, then exited and reloaded the file normally after that. Then I held up for 5 notes, saved and reset again, and finally, held up left for 12 notes. Without going into too much detail, this put me into an area so far out of bounds that I could actually interact with parts of the save file and the game's memory. In fact, variations of the steps I just explained are used to pull off arbitrary code execution and many of the game's other biggest tricks. But for my purposes, all that mattered was that after running up left for 12 notes, I got into a battle, and when I fled from it, it loaded me back into the time skip cutscene from the start of the game, that adds Garrett and Jenna to your party. And so, when the cutscene was over, Jenna was back in the party. But all that happened was that this cutscene played. My story progress had not been reverted, so I was free to leave town and continue the game as normal, except that Jenna was now a permanent member of the party, and this meant that the challenge was properly underway. As for why this glitch happens, from what I understand, what's happening here is that this room has the leaf tiles I mentioned. Obviously, when you step on one, the game has to write some data to its memory. When you go so far out of bounds, glitched leaf tiles actually exist, but because you're so far out of bounds, it ends up writing that data to an incorrect spot in the game's memory, and the spot it writes to is the spot that tells the game where to send you after a battle ends. And, conveniently enough, stepping on the glitched leaf tile I did, and then exiting a battle sends you to the time skip cutscene. If you want to know more about the specifics of the out of bounds glitch, in the description there's a link to a speedrun tutorial, which has a lot more details. Since Jenna is only supposed to be used right at the start of the game, I was curious whether or not she'd be able to equip stuff that comes after that, and thankfully she could. I passed all of Garrett's equipment that she could use over to her, and sold off the rest, which gave her fairly good attack and defense. I also passed Garrett's Jin over to her. Now, remember how I explained that typically, you can equip combinations of Jin to change a character's class and give them new abilities? That functionality isn't programmed into the game for Jenna. She can only ever use her default Flame User class, which gives her a small selection of fire magic for battles, and nothing else. She can still take advantage of the small stat buffs you get for having them equipped, and she can still use their abilities in battle, but she isn't programmed to make use of one of the Jin's main mechanics. I also used the permanent stat boosting items I'd picked up on her. These give you a permanent stat boost of a random value within a certain range when you use them, so I saved and reset to try and get the biggest stat boosts possible. With all that done, she seemed decently equipped. Now that I had Jenna, I was finally able to start training. She actually is not a bad character at all for this early part of the game. She has a multi-target spell that can hit 3 enemies at once, and with her equipment, she wasn't taking too much damage either. So you might be wondering what the problem is. Well, if you've ever tried to over-level in this game before, then you might know that in the game's first dungeon, the game stops giving you random encounters once you're around level 4. But this actually isn't an effect of the first dungeon itself. This property is tied to Jenna. So if you get her out of the first dungeon, this effect will apply elsewhere. Once Jenna has 131 experience, just short of level 4, random encounters cease to exist across the entire game. On the overworld, inside dungeons, no matter how much you run around, you will never get into a battle anywhere. But this doesn't apply to scripted fights like bosses. What this meant is that once Jenna hit 131 experience, the option to train off of random encounters no longer existed, which meant that until other options became available, the challenge also essentially became a low-level run by force. I got Jenna as close to 131 experience as possible without hitting it, and then went to Goma Cave and got into a battle with 3 enemies, which let me blow past 131 experience, and hit level 4 before random encounters were deleted from existence. Of course, this also meant that I couldn't farm for money, so I decided not to upgrade Jenna's equipment at shops until I hit a roadblock, especially since I could always find gear in chests and such. I did buy herbs though, since that was my only way to heal in battle at this point. Since I'd done as few battles as possible as Garrett, I was able to backtrack for the optional Jin I'd skipped. This let me unlock them, and for the ones that you need to defeat to unlock, I was also able to get Jenna a tiny bit of extra experience and money. Jin unfortunately get divided evenly across your party members automatically, so since I had 4 characters, Jenna could only hold 1 Jin until every character had one, and then once I had 5, I could give her 2. Fortunately, 6 Jin are available at this point. I traveled around and collected them all, also grabbing chests along the way to get stuff like the Elven Rapier, which gave Jenna's attack a fairly dramatic boost. And of course, one advantage of random encounters being deleted was that traveling the overworld was pretty fast and painless. The 6th Jin available at this point was inside of Tret Tree, where I had done the glitch to get Jenna, and that was also my next story destination, so once I'd gotten the other 5, I headed there. I grabbed a healing ring inside the dungeon. This thing is quite helpful at this point in the game. If you use it in battle, you can basically cast a healing spell, and it's pretty substantial at around 70 HP. But the downside is that it has a random chance of breaking when used. I didn't want to be without this thing, so I decided I would just reset the game if it ever broke. I tried to fight the 6th Jin, but it actually ended up being way too strong. It would do attacks that took out over half of Jenna's HP at once. I tried all kinds of strategies. I tried summon rushing, where you unequip all of your Jin so you can fire off a bunch of summons in a row. I tried equipping the Jin that would give Jenna the highest defense and agility. I even saved and hard reset the game so I'd get the free turn against it. But it took me down no matter what I did. I decided to cut my losses and go for the boss, and come back for the Jin later when Jenna was stronger. I was a little nervous about my chances against the boss after that, but it ended up being super easy. With the Jin, Granite, and Fever equipped for the highest defense and agility, Jenna always moved before the boss did, and its attacks didn't do much damage, so the fight was very simple. I just attacked until Jenna's HP got low, used an herb to heal, and continued. The only thing that was concerning at all was the boss's move Sleep Star, which can put a character to sleep. But thankfully, every time Jenna did fall asleep, the very next attack from the boss woke her up, and so I took him down on my first try. This got Jenna enough experience to reach level 5. I I headed north to Imil, stocked up on herbs, talked to Mia, and then headed for the Mercury Lighthouse. Now, this dungeon is normally where you get Mia as your 4th party member. Since the sequel to this game lets you get 8 party members, this game actually does have glitchy support for more than 4 party members. So I could get Mia if I wanted to, and the game wouldn't completely explode. But if I did get Mia, then the game would be dividing my Jin between 5 characters instead of 4. And considering the Jin were one of the very few ways I had to improve Jenna's strength, I didn't want them to be spread evenly across even more characters. So instead, I decided to just skip getting Mia. This is actually very easy to do. I went through the first few rooms normally, until the room where Mia is supposed to join you. Then I did the retreat glitch again, which I used to get out of bounds in Tret Tree. Saving and resetting after attempting to use retreat when you don't have enough PP causes weird effects, but it also does weird stuff even if you don't save and reset. After casting the spell, I walked into this door, and warped straight to the end of the dungeon. There's a Jin inside the dungeon, and you can get to it by doing this glitch on other doors, but I tried it and it destroyed me much like the one in Tret Tree. I tried the boss Saturos, but he destroyed me too. And as a reminder, with random encounters disabled, there was not a single point of experience to be had in any of the areas I had access to. Fortunately, I did have an idea. First, I left the lighthouse and headed back to town, and finally purchased some equipment upgrades for Jenna. Then I headed back to the lighthouse and went for the Jin. Like I mentioned earlier when fleeing with Garrett, the game has 2 values that determine RNG. GRN is used for determining things like who goes first when 2 characters have similar agility, and who an enemy targets with a move. BRN is used for everything else, like what attacks an enemy does, what damage those attacks deal, and so on. And as I mentioned, when you save the game, perform a hard reset, and then reload your file, both of these values are reset to 0. To put that another way, the game's RNG will always be exactly the same when you reload your file after a hard reset. If you load your file, enter a fight, and then do the same actions, every single turn will be identical across attempts. The enemy will do the same moves in the same order, and they'll do the same amount of damage. There's a little bit more to it than that, but I'll get into that when it's relevant later on. But basically, this means that we can take advantage of this to essentially create a turn-by-turn route through a battle to win. This doesn't guarantee success, because obviously if a single attack defeats you, or does enough damage that you have to heal every turn, then there's no way around that, but as long as you're strong enough to withstand attacks and fight back, you can kind of create a turn-by-turn route to victory. This felt a little cheap in some ways, but then again, given the impossible hand I was dealt, I was okay with clawing my way to a win that seemed otherwise impossible. I decided to use this hard reset routing strategy only as a last resort though. Since Jenna's Jin were the only one I needed to have equipped, I could leave the other character's Jin unequipped to use them for summons. The Jin is weak to fire, so I used Fever to attack it on turn 2, did the tier 2 fire summon, defended until Fever recovered, and then used it again and did the tier 1 fire summon for the win. This got me the Jin, and also got Jenna up to level 6. Notably, she learned the Flare Wall spell, which is cool because getting her to this level is normally impossible. Also, for the sake of transparency, I didn't fully understand how the RNG worked when I started this playthrough, so on a few of the fights leading up to this point, I was hard resetting before them without realizing it made a difference. Like, I beat Tret first try, but I first entered the battle to test how strong different attack options were, and then reset from the NSO menu once I had tried a few to do my first proper attempt. And for the bandits with Garrett, I had been resetting from the NSO menu instead of soft resetting, so I had consistent RNG without realizing it. It's kind of a weird trick, because if you save the game before a fight and then turn the game off to come back to later, well, when you come back, that's the RNG manipulation, and you probably wouldn't even realize it. Just wanted to put that disclaimer. From this point on, I decided that for any fights where I wasn't trying to do RNG manipulation, I'd be sure to do a soft reset instead. With the new Jin equipment and level up, I headed back to Tret Tree to take on the previous Jin. I didn't even have to do that strategy I just explained, because with the new equipment and level, Jenna was able to take it down easily enough. And then I headed back to the lighthouse, and equipped Jenna with the 2 new Jin. Breeze in particular has a very helpful ability. If you use it, you can raise your resistance to magical attacks by 40. You can use it twice to stack it, so I could boost Jenna's resistance to Saturos' magic attacks by 80. Most of his attacks are magic, so this was a significant advantage. Now, this fight was still very precise. Jenna was level 6, with no way of getting any stronger, and I was up against a boss that often gives players trouble on normal playthroughs. But as I explained, you can guarantee consistent RNG by hard resetting and then writing down a turn-by-turn guide. To be more specific, I went into the fight and wrote down an 80-step guide on what to do on every single turn to win. So on turn 1, I try something, and if I survive the turn, then I add it to the list. Then I try something for turn 2, and if I survive I add it to the list, and if I get defeated, then I retry the turn and do something else. And that repeats until the fight is over. Sometimes you might even have to go back a few turns, and make changes to avoid a death a few turns later. If you play a modern re-release of the game like NSO, you can save yourself tons and tons of time by doing this using suspend points and rewind, but this is totally doable on an actual Game Boy Advance too. You just have to reset the game and redo your steps over and over again every time you make a wrong choice. But the fight basically needed this level of precision. Then, once I'd made my route, I reset the game again, and did it in one clean, legitimate run. The strategy here was to use Breeze to raise Jenna's resistance by 40, then use a Nut to heal her to full after the boss's next attack, and then summon Atalanta, then heal again, use Breeze to bring Jenna's resistance to 80, and heal again. With Jenna's resistance at 80, the boss's attacks are a lot easier to take. From here, you mostly go into a cycle of summoning Jupiter, healing, using Breeze, and repeating. Although the resistance boost caps out at 80, using Breeze again while the boost is still active extends its duration, so you can make sure it never wears off. Typically, I healed with the healing ring I'd picked up in Tret Tree, which gives the solid heal of 70 HP, but it has the random chance of breaking, and if it does, you're screwed, because you need that bigger heal sometimes. Good healing items like nuts aren't available for purchase yet, so there's a very finite number of them available, making the healing ring the only way to get great healing here. This was actually the biggest advantage of routing out my turns. Because I had already gone through the battle, I knew what turns would break the ring, so I used an herb on those turns instead. With the strategy set up, I finally took Saturos down and got Jenna to level 7. With that done, I got the water to heal Tret, moved a tree stump to get a stat boosting item later, healed Tret, got the stat boosting item, and then went back to Bilibin. For curing Tret, I got to pick a reward. I decided to get the Water of Life. This item lets you revive someone, which made it pointless given that this was a solo run, but you can sell it for 3,000 coins, which would more than double what I had. Also, you can go back to Mercury Lighthouse whenever you want to refill your bottle with Hermes water, which heals you completely. So if I ever got truly desperate for healing later on, that was another option. Since I had some extra cash, I decided to splurge on some better gear. Then I headed to the next dungeon. This place doesn't have a boss, and it was mostly focused on puzzles, but there were a few enemies inside. There was a mimic that was fairly tough, but I got it after a few tries. There was also a djinn here, but once again I couldn't seem to take it down. There was something I wanted to do that I thought might help though. When a djinn is unequipped, you can use it for a summon, and when you do that, the djinn goes into recovery mode. In battle, this lasts for a few turns, and outside of battle, you just need to run around a little bit, so it's usually inconsequential. But djinn on defeated characters don't recover, and you can't trade them to other characters until they are recovered. And I couldn't just revive a character and get them defeated again in a battle, because random encounters were gone. So up to this point, any djinn the other characters were holding that I'd used for a summon had been completely out of commission. But this dungeon is the first to feature tiles that damage you, so I went outside and revived everyone, ran around until the djinn were recovered, and then went and got everyone defeated by the spikes again. Now I had a way to recover djinn, though it would cost me a little bit of money for the revival cost each time I did it. Even with the new djinn though, I still couldn't defeat it. I even tried doing the routing strategy here, but it always seemed to run away no matter what I did. I'm sure there's some way I could have done it, but I decided to just come back later when Jenna had better stats. So I got through the dungeon, got the Force Synergy, and then headed to Mogul Forest. And this place finally marked a huge turning point for the playthrough. Why's that? Well, in this forest, you can use the Force Synergy to hit these stumps, and a monster pops out of some of these stumps if you hit them. You can even leave the area to make them respawn. In other words, I now had a respawnable scripted fight that I could use to train. It has a strong move called Ransack, and I had to keep Jenna's HP above around 70 to survive it, but other than that it was simple enough. My strategy was basically to spam the Fever Djinn. I attacked with it, selected it the following turn to re-equip it, and repeated, throwing in heals where necessary. By defeating an enemy using a djinn attack of an element it's weak to, you can do a rainbow kill, where the enemy flashes colors before it dies. This increases the experience and money it gives you, and also increases the drop rate for items. So not only could I farm for money and levels, but the enemy also dropped a vial after every battle, which heal for 500 HP, a full heal for Jenna. It took me quite a while, but I decided to take Jenna to level 15, so things would be a little less tight for a while. I also made sure not to use any of the vials while training. This let me save up over 60 of them. After that, I went back to the previous dungeon and took on the djinn again, and I managed to take it down this time. It still hit for very good damage, but Jenna's extra HP and defense allowed her to tank the hits better, so I just spammed djinn attacks and won. All 4 characters now had 2 djinn, which meant that the next time I got one, Jenna would be able to hold 3. It didn't take long until that happened either. I headed back to the forest to properly progress through it, and took on the djinn there. While here, I also made sure to pick up items like an apple to increase Jenna's attack, and an elven shirt. The elven shirt is very helpful. In addition to giving Jenna's defense a decent boost, it also multiplies her agility by 1.5, which meant that this thing would pretty much always be useful if I needed to outspeed an enemy. At the end of the dungeon, I took on the next boss. It wasn't particularly difficult. Now that Jenna had better stats and a huge stack of vials for healing, I basically just spammed regular attacks every turn, and healed to full using a vial when Jenna's HP got low enough that I felt like a ransack would take her out. With this approach, it wasn't very hard at all. In the next town, now that I had so much more money, I decided to upgrade my gear as I reached new shops. There's a gin in this town, but you need the Frost Synergy from Mia to get it. Fortunately, in the very next town after this one, you actually get an item that lets any character use Frost, so I could come back for this gin shortly. But less fortunately, near this town, there's also another gin that you get by randomly encountering it in the overworld, and then defeating it there. Since Jenna had disabled random encounters, this gin was completely off limits. There are a few of these overworld gin in the game, and they were all off limits when Jenna's encounter suppression was active. After scaring the locals, I headed for the next town. There's an area along the way with another stat boosting item, but once again, you can't get it without Frost. The next town was flooded by water monsters, so I had to defeat them to save the town. These things weren't particularly difficult. I just took them down with regular attacks, healing when necessary. The very first one gave me the item that let me use Frost, so I decided to immediately go back to get the gin in the previous town, as well as the stat boosting item to boost Jenna's maximum HP. As I worked my way through the dungeon and slowly unflooded the town, I gained access to the town's armor shop, which let me get in there to upgrade Jenna's defense a little further. Eventually, I reached the boss. This fight was simple enough, though it also wasn't a complete cakewalk. It was weak against Fire Djinn, so like in my training against the enemies in Mogul Forest, I would attack using Fever, equip Fever again next turn, and repeat. Every attack with Fever dealt almost 100 damage, and also had a chance to hit it with the Delusion status effect, which just lowered accuracy for its regular attacks. Its attacks were fairly powerful, but they weren't unmanageable. The boss had quite a bit of HP, so it took a while to take it down, but I did eventually manage to. Jenna also got to level 16 from the battle. After the battle, I got the item that gives you the Lift Synergy, and I used it to get a cookie that increased Jenna's maximum PP. Then I headed out of the caves and off to the next town, where Ivan learned the Reveal Synergy so I could take on the desert nearby. There's another Djinn to get here in the desert, and its effect when you use it is similar to Fever's, in that it doesn't attack and has a chance to inflict the Delusion status effect, but the attack power of this one is stronger. So since I had approached some fights by spamming Fever, I thought this might make for a good replacement. This area also had 2 permanent stat boosting items. I moved through the area, and soon reached the boss. This thing was tough. It can move twice per turn, and it has several incredibly powerful moves. It can do Poison Tail, which does huge damage on its own, and poisons you, which does significant damage as well. The boss can also curse you, which, if successful, instantly kills you a few turns later. And, ignoring those, its other attacks also did huge damage. I threw multiple strategies at this thing. For example, this fight has a special mechanic I was able to take advantage of. Some enemies in this game attack in a specific order, as in they have a list of moves they'll use in the exact same order on a loop. This thing is one such enemy, and it only has around 80 PP, so if you just stall by healing and defending, it's guaranteed to run out of PP after a few rounds. This means that as long as you get lucky, and the instant kill curse doesn't get applied to you on the rounds where he's able to use it, it's removed from the battle entirely. But when the boss runs out of PP, moves in its list that require PP are replaced by a use of Poison Tail instead, which really isn't any easier to deal with. It still does massive damage twice per turn. 2 attacks plus the inevitable poison damage meant I never really had an opening to do anything. I also tried Summon Rushing. This actually does take out a substantial portion of the boss's HP, but it's not enough to defeat it, and leaving Jenna's Djinn unequipped for summons made her stats too low to survive the boss's attacks, and leaving Jenna's equipped while unequipping the rest of the parties didn't really do the same kind of damage. I even tried a strategy where I started Jenna with 3 unequipped water Djinn, used the tier 3 water summon, and then kept Jenna healed up, and the 3 Djinn would recover to bring her stats back up. Once I ran out of other summons, I started using water Djinn attacks, and their power was increased, because the summons increase your elemental attack power. But even keeping an eye on the order of the moves the boss was using, it was just too strong and Jenna couldn't keep up. At her current strength, it just didn't seem doable. So it was back to the grind. Luckily, this very desert actually had a very good replacement for the forest enemies I'd used earlier. Sometimes when using Ivan's Reveal Synergy, you'll find a monster. These are scripted, repeatable fights, and you don't even need to leave the area for these ones. When the battle's done, just use Reveal again and it'll be back. On top of that, killing it with Djinn it was weak to gave me better experience and money than the forest had, and these enemies also dropped vials, so I could farm for more of those. Jenna was at level 16, so I decided to take her up by 5 levels to level 21 for a bit of a boost. Along the way at level 18, Queen, she also learned the Flare Storm synergy, which is another move she should absolutely never be able to access in this game. But this is also the very last synergy she can learn. At level 21, I went and tried the boss again. It still wasn't easy. With Jenna's increased HP and stats, she was able to tank hits and survive much more easily, but once the boss ran out of PP, it still did far too much damage to really fight back. You'd think that it running out of PP would make the fight easier, but when it tries to cast spells like Curse or Impair, that meant I got a turn where I wasn't taking damage, which made things much more manageable. So winning the fight before it ran out actually seemed like my best bet. Unfortunately, it didn't seem like I was doing much better. Since it uses moves in the same order every time, I was able to keep an eye on its move list to know what moves it was going to use next, so I could tell whether it was worth healing up or not. But doing it this way meant I was approaching the fight very slowly, and although I could survive, it would inevitably run out of PP and then start doing its attacks and poison tails. These took out over half of Jenna's HP every turn, so I really couldn't do anything except heal every turn. The only real counter I could think of was using the Sleet Djinn to lower its attack, but that only has a random chance of working, and I could never seem to land it. So it was back to the grind again. I got Jenna 2 more levels to get her up to level 23, and then gave the fight another shot. And although it took me quite a few tries, I did manage to finally take it down this time. My winning approach was a bit different than my previous ones. I started by doing the tier 3 water summon, followed by the tier 4 thunder summon as before, but I didn't do the earth one after that like I had before. Instead, I immediately transitioned into using the water djinn, since the water summon would let me do a bit more damage. I kept an eye on the boss's moves so I knew what was coming up next, and healed or attacked accordingly. Once I'd used 3 water djinn, I used the tier 3 water summon again. Around this point, it ran out of PP and started dishing out big damage again. I managed to use 2 more of the water djinn, but Jenna had been inflicted with the instant death curse, and at this point it was pretty close to activating. Even if it didn't, I felt like the boss's damage might take her out soon anyway. So, knowing that the boss's HP was low at this point, I threw caution to the wind and gambled on a tier 2 water summon, and this did enough damage to finally take it down. On this winning attempt, I also got lucky, and somehow managed to never get poisoned until the second last turn. And so, 7 levels later, I was finally able to proceed. Since Jenna had gotten poisoned right before the end of the fight, she was still poisoned outside of battle, and it did big damage even on the overworld, so I had to keep healing her up as I traveled to the next town. Once I made it, I went to the Sanctum to cure it. I bought some armor upgrades, and then got a new djinn, which brought my total djinn count high enough that Jenna could now hold 4. I revived Garrett and Ivan, let their djinn recover from the summons, and then let them die to the desert heat. Then I headed north of town. The bridge back to the early areas of the game was now fixed, and I used that to head back to Vault, where I got a new piece of armor and another new djinn. I headed back to Vale for more items and another new djinn. Then I headed back to Calais to progress the story, and grabbed a water jacket from the palace, which increases defense and resistance to both fire and water attacks. Then I headed for the docks to sail to the next area. The next section of the game is a ship ride. While on board, you do a few battles on the way to your destination. These battles aren't hard at all. In fact, they're weak to fire, so Jenna's spells actually came in handy, since the strongest spell could wipe out all 3 enemies in 2 turns. The Kraken boss towards the end of the ride was a different story though. Just like with the Manticore boss in the desert, it can move twice per turn, and the damage this thing did far outclassed even what the Manticore had been doing. The boss was weak to the stun and sleep status effects, and I had djinn that could do both. Mist for putting it to sleep, and Scorch for stunning it. I threw myself at the fight for a while, but didn't get very far. It was essentially total luck. The Kraken did so much damage that it was pretty much impossible to stay on the offensive without the status effect working every time. I needed luck to go my way, and fortunately, I had a way to do that. I decided to use the hard reset routing strategy here, because it seemed like the only other way to win would be to grind for hours and hours in the desert again, and that didn't really seem any more fun or interesting. I even checked a few other solo runs on YouTube, and several of them used the routing strategy as well, or grinded to a really high level. And even then, every other character has access to classes, which gives them a ton of abilities and stat boosts, an advantage Jenna doesn't have, and you're normally expected to beat the entire game at around level 30. So getting up to that kind of level off a desert enemy that gave 200 experience per battle would take ages. So I was fine using the strategy here. The approach was to use the Scorch Djinn to stun the boss, or the Mist Djinn to put it to sleep. On turns where I found that neither status effect worked, I'd either do another attack like a summon if Jenna's HP was high enough, or I'd heal with a vial. The basic idea was to keep the boss stunned or asleep as much as possible, and re-equip the Djinn I used to apply the effect while it was active. And after 39 turns, I even defeated the boss with an attack from Scorch, which got me some extra experience and money since it was weak to it. Now, immediately after the Kraken fight, I set up something else. Between each battle, you have to pick a passenger to row the ship. After the Kraken fight, I picked my last one, and this combination was unbalanced enough to put the ship off course. This let me access Crossbone Isle, the game's optional super dungeon, right now. This dungeon has 10 floors, and the door of each floor requires you to fight a mini-boss to get in. You can't complete the entire island right now if you get to it early like this, since you need abilities you get later, but you can still get through the first few floors. The main reason I wanted to do this was to get my hands on some items, like permanent stat boosters, without having to wait until I could come here later. Since I'd used so many Jinn for summons against the Kraken, I revived the rest of the party to let the Jinn recover, which meant I had to get them defeated in the first battle inside. The first battle was a bit of a challenge, but nowhere near as brutal as the Kraken or Manticore had been. I started by defending with everyone repeatedly until the party went down, and then started fighting with Jenna. I took out the smaller enemies with Jinn attacks first. Once the main boss was alone, it wasn't too bad. I started by doing regular attacks, but eventually switched to spamming Scorch by attacking with it, re-equipping, and immediately using it again, since it had a chance to stun. I kept Jenna healed up, and he went down before too long. I got the items from the room, and then headed to the next floor. The next boss was a lot harder than I expected. The Grizzlies can buff their attack, and if they did, the fight became pretty much unwinnable. I threw myself at the fight dozens of times until I won. Basically, by using the Thor summon, the Judgment summon, and then the Kieran summon, the enemies take enough damage that casting the Flare Storm spell takes out 2 of them. However, if they buff their attack even once before that happens, then it becomes borderline impossible. I tried over and over, until I eventually got an attempt where they didn't do it until late into my strategy. At that point, I was close enough to taking them down that I just healed repeatedly, until a turn where I felt I had been left with enough HP to take 1 buffed attack the following turn, and then used Flare Storm to take out 2 of them. From there, it was just a matter of staying healed up, and doing 2 more Flare Storms to take it out. This fight might not sound too difficult, but Jenna's maximum HP was 261 with the Jinn I was using, and once the Grizzlies buffed their attack, a single hit from one of them could deal around 150 damage. But eventually I took them down. I headed into the room and collected my rewards. The next boss was also pretty tough. It didn't seem like it was that difficult at first, but the main boss had all kinds of status effects it could do, and the smaller ones could deal fairly good damage, and also poison Jenna. The main thing I was worried about was the main boss cursing her, because that meant she was dead in 7 turns. I had to try the fight quite a few times, but I eventually won. The smaller enemies are weak to fire, and the main boss took decent damage from it as well, so I used Jenna's Flare Storm every turn, unless I needed to heal. When the main boss would block Jenna from using Synergy, I switched to using regular attacks on the main boss instead until it wore off. After enough time healing and attacking, the smaller enemies went down, and then the main boss went down to a single attack from Scorch. I headed into the room, collected my rewards, and then headed down. But after trying the next boss, I decided to say screw it and left. This fight was dealing way more damage than the previous ones, and even if I did beat it, the room inside is actually the dead end for this point in the game, and you need to come back later with new abilities to get the rewards inside and progress past it. So I decided to head back up to the ship and headed off for the next area. The boat took me near the town of Tolby, but before I headed there, I went along the coast to the north to get another Jinn. Then I headed east from Tolby to reach the Gondwan cave, where I got an apple to boost Jenna's attack. You can also use this cave as a way to get back to the areas from before the boat ride, and I took advantage of this immediately to revive the other characters to recover their Jinn, and then kill them off again back in the desert. Then I headed back to the Tolby area again, and headed south. The story directs you this way later, but I was able to head through these areas right now to get my hands on a bunch of valuable items. I got an item to boost Jenna's defense in Suhala, and then headed for Suhala Desert. There are a bunch of scripted battles here that I had to get through every time I wanted to get through the desert, and although they were decently powerful at this point, I was able to just reset the game until I put them to sleep, and they weren't too hard after that. They also gave a fairly substantial amount of experience even without the rainbow kill, so I was able to gain another level for Jenna as I worked my way through. This eventually let me get to some items, including a cookie to boost Jenna's max PP. Later in the desert there's also a Jinn. I had a bit of trouble at first, because Jenna was slower than it, so I was never able to heal in time. But luckily, throughout the game I hadn't been selling all of my gear as I replaced it. For stuff I thought might be situationally useful later on, I kept it in Garrett's inventory so I could grab it as necessary. I put the elven shirt back on Jenna. This lowered her defense a bit, but gave her agility a massive boost. This made her faster than the Jinn, so I was able to heal when I needed to, and took it down. This also meant I had enough Jinn for Jenna to hold 5 at once. Then I left the desert. As a fun little aside, there's a boss here that chases you in a tornado, but you can actually outrun it fairly easily, so I did that to skip it for now. But in any case, this was where my big detour adventure ended. The next area was Suhala Gate, where you're blocked from proceeding until the story directs you here later on. So I finally headed to Tolby, with an extra Jinn, extra equipment, and a bunch of extra stat boosts. The first thing I did upon arriving was get a power bread to boost Jenna's max HP. Then I went to the shop to restock and sell some items. I also got Jenna a new piece of headgear, but didn't upgrade the rest of her gear. For armor, this was because I'd lose the agility boost from the elven shirt, but there was also another reason I didn't upgrade the rest of her gear. Throughout the game, you can get these things called lucky medals, and whenever you make a purchase at a shop, you'll sometimes be given a free game ticket. Tolby is where you use these, and it's essentially a casino town. Using the medals and tickets, you have a chance of winning super valuable items, including powerful equipment. And of course, I could just reset the game until I got the items I wanted. In the palace, I grabbed this to increase Jenna's defense. And with all that done, I finally headed to the next story destination, Altmiller Cave. I got an old man his juice box, got Jenna a cookie, and got invited to take part in Colosso, a big fighting tournament back in Tolby. This posed a bit of a problem. In Colosso, you're forced to play as Isaac solo, and you're stripped of all of your gear and items during the matches, so I couldn't load him up with Jenna's equipment even if I wanted to. And of course, since I had used Isaac literally 0 times, he had a whopping 0 experience and was still at level 1. There's also something scary about Colosso for the purposes of this particular run. When you enter, you do little sequences where you play as each character, so Jenna is removed from the party, and Mia appears. Thankfully, and somewhat strangely, rather than simply adding Isaac, Garrett, Ivan, and Mia to your party when Colosso is over, the game saves your original lineup when you enter. I guess this is so that your party stays in the original order you had them in, so when Colosso is over, it will give Jenna back. As you might expect, given that Isaac was level 1 and had no equipment, the hard reset routing strategy was basically a necessity here. Isaac could only take 2 hits before dying, and that was only if he had enough Jinn equipped. And there's no way to outspeed the opponent, so unless you do something to prevent them from attacking the following turn, there's no way to heal before they hit you again, so you're basically dead the instant you take any damage. With that in mind, I set Isaac up with these 5 Jinn. Every opponent in Colosso only has 2 proper moves, a regular attack and a defend. They do also have items that can harm you, but this meant that hitting an opponent with the usually mediocre delusion status effect was actually incredibly helpful here, because it meant there was a very good chance the enemy's primary method of attacking would miss. 2 of Isaac's Jinn could inflict delusion, 2 of them could inflict paralysis, and 1 could inflict sleep. Also, each round of Colosso has you run through an obstacle course before the fight. There are items along the way, but going out of your way to get them costs you time, and making it to the end of the course before your opponent gets you a powerful piece of equipment for the fight. If your opponent gets there first, then they get it, which would make things even harder. So it's absolutely essential that you pick up every item on the course, and also reach the end first. You can save the game on the course, so once you get an attempt where you get all the items and get to the end first, you can save your progress right next to the finish line, which is also what lets you do the hard reset routing strategy. Once I was there, I basically just needed to route out a fight where I either landed a status effect every turn so the enemy couldn't touch Isaac, or I healed when they were unable to move. The second fight was largely the same idea. And with that, I'd actually succeeded in getting through Colosso with a level 1 Isaac. Colosso has 3 rounds, but you only need to beat the first 2 rounds to continue the story. If you win the 3rd round, your prize for winning the tournament is the lure cap, which increases the encounter rate to make training easier. I was kind of curious whether the lure cap would ignore Jenna deleting the encounters and bring them back when I equipped it, but I tried to beat the 3rd fight and it was substantially more difficult. And then I asked in the speedrun Discord, and a user named Ree said that Jenna's encounter suppression takes priority over the lure cap anyway. So there was really no benefit to winning Colosso. So I threw the match with pleasure, and after the cutscene, Mia got banished to the Shadow Realm and Jenna was back. But I quickly realized that things were not as normal as they seemed. Like I said it would earlier, the game gave back my party of Jenna, Isaac, Garrett, and Ivan. But I headed outside of town, and I was baffled when a random encounter appeared. I went into the menu and changed the order of my party, because I felt like I remembered seeing some comment about Jenna's encounter suppression in the party lineup in my research, and to my surprise, a duplicate 5th character appeared in the party, and now random encounters were gone again. Shifting the order of my characters now seemed to work in a completely nonsensical way, and the duplicate character could change which character it was a duplicate of like a ditto. I went and asked the speedrun community what was going on, and based on information from TL Plexa and FX, here's what I was able to figure out. When the game adds characters to your party, it doesn't just add them to your party. Instead, it's basically a 2-part process. First, the game sets a number of character slots to be active, and then sets characters to fill those slots. So after finishing Colosso, the game says that the party should have 4 active slots, and then fills those slots with the characters I had before. On a normal playthrough, it'll properly fill those slots with Isaac, Garrett, Ivan, and Mia. But if you skip getting Mia so you only have 3 characters, when Colosso ends, it'll fill the first 3 slots like normal, and then since a 4th slot is open but has no character, it puts a weird glitchy character there that takes the properties of another character. Now obviously, I do have 4 characters, but since Jenna isn't one of the proper normal party members, it doesn't seem to check for her properly. So, it fills the 4 slots with my 4 characters, but only sees the 3 that are supposed to be there, and thinks that there's an empty slot that needs to be filled, so it ends up putting this glitchy duplicate character in slot 5. But since Colosso set the party to have 4 active slots, this character is invisible and inactive, and only appears when I change the party lineup, which makes it check all the characters again and set things properly. This is also why random encounters are back, and why they disappear when the party is rearranged. The game doesn't properly realize that Jenna is in the party, so it doesn't apply her encounter deletion property. Rearranging the party makes the game check the characters, at which point it realizes she's there and gets rid of the encounters again. This meant I now had a unique opportunity. As long as I didn't rearrange the order of my characters, random encounters were enabled again, so I could finally go back and get all of the Jinn from the overworld that had been off limits up to this point. Then, once I had them all, I could rearrange my party to get rid of random encounters again. And although I'd have a glitchy extra character in my group, I could travel around again without the fear of battles wearing Jenna down. And I had to backtrack to get to the next area I was going to anyway, so I could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I watched the next story cutscene, got the cloak ball, went and got my characters killed off in an actual battle for once, and then healed Jenna back up. Then I made my way to Lunpa, a town near the early areas of the game. You can get into Lunpa much earlier in the game, but you can't do much there until you have the cloak synergy from the cloak ball I just got. Now that I had it, I could complete a major side quest there. And of course, on the way there I made sure to grab the overworld Jinn. Getting them all also got me enough that Jenna could hold an additional Jinn again, so she could now hold 6. After I got the last overworld Jinn, I rearranged the party. This got rid of random encounters, and made the glitchy duplicate 5th character appear in menus. Since the game isn't properly designed to work with 5 characters, this actually causes some weird effects. For example, opening the menu no longer shows the character statuses in the corner, and opening the menu will also often cause graphical glitches in the map I'm currently in. In some areas, it can even do strange stuff like mess with the collision. And sometimes, it does stuff like add a bit of red to the text boxes, which I can get rid of by resetting. But these all felt like small prices to pay for the safety of eliminating random encounters from the game again. I headed to Lunpa. The fortress was mostly pretty easy. By just spamming Scorch on the bandits inside, they'd get stunned almost every turn, so most of the battles were pretty effortless. I also picked up a power bread inside to increase Jenna's maximum HP. At the end of the dungeon there was a boss. This thing was actually fairly tricky. Its damage isn't that crazy, but it's substantial enough that healing is definitely necessary. But it also automatically recovers 80 HP every single turn. So if I need to spend 1 turn healing, that means I attack, it heals, I heal, and it heals again. So it can restore 160 HP after an attack from me. Doing regular attacks or Scorch attacks wasn't good enough, because they didn't deal nearly enough damage to keep up with the healing. But after a few tries, I came up with a strategy that worked. The boss took the most damage from the tier 4 Fire Summon Meteor, so I moved all of my Fire Jinn to Jenna so her entire stock of 6 was fire. I started the battle with 4 of them inactive, and 2 of them active, which let me open the battle with a tier 4 summon, while also having the stat boosts from the 2 that were active. Once I used the summon, the 4 Jinn I'd used to do it would recover each turn, and I used each of them as they recovered, and then did another tier 4 summon once they were all inactive again. Summoning it also raises Jenna's firepower, so the future summons were even stronger. I repeated this a few times, healing as necessary, and I managed to take it down. Although the boss still recovered 80 HP every turn, dealing over 800 damage, and then over 1000 damage every 5 or 6 turns, was more than enough to outpace the 400 to 480 HP he recovered in that time frame. After winning, I saved Hammett, got an apple to boost Jenna's attack, and then got another Jinn. The only noteworthy thing here is that when I got the Jinn, I opened the menu to take a look at it, and then when I closed the menu, the glitchy menus had caused Isaac to completely disappear. I saved the game and reset, and Isaac fell from the skies and ended up out of bounds. Thankfully, I was able to get out of the cave by casting Retreat to warp back to the entrance. With that done, I was actually pretty close to the end of the game. There was still the optional Crossbone Isle dungeon to take on, where the game's super boss was, but I didn't think I had any chance at beating that boss without getting the best equipment possible, and that meant progressing through to the end of the game to grab some stuff from the final dungeon, as well as getting the last few Jinn and stat boosting items along the way. But I did head to Crossbone Isle now to get a Jinn. The Jinn here is called Bane, and it's very powerful. It has a chance to inflict an enemy with venom, which does a colossal amount of damage every turn. That would be very helpful for level grinding when I needed to later on, so I decided I wanted to get it as soon as possible. Getting into Crossbone Isle was itself a bit of an ordeal now, because having the 5th character completely destroyed the exterior area. Like, I used reveal by accident, exited it, and the entire screen looked like this. Then I saved and reset, and Isaac pierced the fabric of reality. I saved and reloaded a file I'd made just outside, and thankfully it wasn't that hard of a problem to solve. You just have to set the growth synergy to a shortcut button so you can use it without needing to open the menu. Once I was in, I headed back down to the boss I'd struggled with on my original visit. My strategy was basically to just spam Scorch on the first one. They seemed fairly susceptible to being stunned, and it would often last for several turns when it worked. So that meant I was only taking damage from one of them, which wasn't nearly as hard to deal with. When neither of them were stunned, they could do quite a lot of damage, so I was pretty overcautious when it came to healing, but it wasn't too hard to manage when one of them was stunned. When the first one went down, I spammed it on the other one, and it went down before too long. On this floor, the most notable reward I got was the Storm Gear. This seemed to me like the best armor I could get for Jenna. In addition to increasing her defense by quite a lot, it also gave very good resistance to every element except Earth. The battle on the next floor was tough. The main guy is the Lizard King, who can hit Jenna for around 150 damage in a single attack. The other 3 enemies aren't usually that much of an issue, except that the little ones can randomly decide to self-destruct and do 200 damage at once, and the bigger one has a chance to stun you. Thankfully, all 3 of the smaller enemies only have a small amount of HP, so after trying it a few times, I came up with a strategy where I put all of the Fire Djinn on Jenna like I had with the boss in Lunpa. I left 4 unequipped, but made sure that Scorch was one of the ones that was still equipped. I used Scorch on turn 1, and reset the battle over and over, until this initial Scorch attack stunned the Lizard King. Then, assuming none of the little ones self-destructed to kill Jenna, which did happen more than once, I used the tier 4 Fire Summon. I expected this to kill all 3 of the little enemies, but to my surprise, the self-destructing one survived. I healed and attacked one of them to defeat it, and the other one did self-destruct, but Jenna had enough HP to tank the hit. From there I just spammed Scorch on the Lizard King, and he got stunned fairly often. When he wasn't stunned, he'd often use Ice Blessing to take out over half of Jenna's HP at once, and I'd have to heal a few times in a row when he spammed that, but inevitably he'd switch to another move and I'd have my opening. On the next floor were these chimeras. They use fire magic, so I thought I'd be alright since Jenna is aligned with fire, but their physical attacks were crazy and did a huge amount of damage, and they could also infect Jenna with venom to do a ton of damage every turn. It took a number of tries, but eventually I came up with a strategy that worked. It was basically a summon rush. I kept the Tonic Djinn equipped, which heals all status effects, but unequipped the other Water Djinn. Then I basically used every tier 4 summon, healing HP and the venom using Tonic when necessary. On one attempt, using 3 summons took one of the enemies down, but not the other, and I ended up dying to the last one. So on another attempt, I used the 3rd summon when my HP was fairly low, because I thought one of them would die, and I'd only have to tank 1 hit. But this time it didn't kill either. Thankfully, I got lucky and they both used status moves that turn, so I was able to heal up. Once I used the 4th summon and took one down, I just did regular attacks on the other one. Even this one alone still did tons of damage, so sometimes I had to heal Jenna several turns in a row, but eventually I had enough openings to take it down. And this was the floor I was trying to reach. I grabbed the Bane Djinn. The main reason I wanted this is because the pink tornado you use to get to Crossbone Isle actually has a monster in it if you use Douse on it. It's very, very powerful, but if you use Bane on it, and it inflicts venom, the boss dies in 3 turns. It takes 600 damage after every action, and moves twice per turn, so it takes 1200 damage every single turn. It also gives you over 1300 experience, and drops a potion every time you defeat it, which heals 100% of your HP. So I spent a while here, saving and resetting until Bane's venom landed turn 1, then healing and defending until it went down and repeating. I hopped back to town when I had to restock. The enemy drops over 6,000 gold per battle as well, so money was no longer a concern. I grinded here for a while until I got Jenna from level 25 up to 32. I went back to town and revived the party to recover their Djinn from the summons I'd done, then backtracked to the previous desert to let them die in the heat again. Then I finally progressed back to the checkpoint I'd been stopped at when I first arrived near Tolby. Now that I was supposed to head there for the story, I was able to get through, and I got a mint to increase Jenna's agility, and another Djinn, which meant Jenna could finally hold the maximum of 7 at once. Soon I made it to Lolivero, the game's final town. This also meant I had access to the game's final equipment shop. The 2 noteworthy weapon options here were the Crystal Rod and the Swift Sword. The Rod actually gives 2 extra attack points, but the Unleash effect of the Swift Sword can triple the damage of a normal attack. Since it was such a minor attack point difference, and the Unleash effect was so good, I decided to get the sword. As for armor, I grabbed the War Gloves. I actually could have gotten these earlier, but I was originally planning on getting the Spirit Armlet. But at the cost of only a little bit of defense, the War Gloves gave Jenna's attack a pretty sizable boost, which I felt might be more helpful in the long run, especially given the Swift Sword's potential to triple the damage of a normal attack. While in town, I also grabbed the second last Djinn I'd be able to get. Then I headed north for Bobby Lighthouse, where I got the final Djinn. I was able to get the complete collection, barring the one that was stuck on Mia. Then I grabbed a Lucky Pepper to boost Jenna's luck, and that was the very last stat boosting item in the game too. Next I headed for Venus Lighthouse, the game's final dungeon. Like I mentioned, I didn't want to complete it just yet, but I wanted to go through the first few rooms until I got the Thunder Crown. This thing has the highest defense stat of any headgear in the game. The downside is that it's cursed, which means it'll randomly paralyze you for a turn. But on floor 8 of Crossbone Isle, there's a cleric's ring you can get that negates the negative effects of cursed gear when equipped. So I'd equip that ring, equip this crown, and then Jenna would finally have her final equipment loadout for the rest of the game. So I headed off to do just that. I headed back to Crossbone Isle, with the goal of finally making it all the way to the bottom and taking down the super boss. The next floor boss was fairly powerful. Fortunately, the Djinn I got one floor earlier on my last visit was my key to victory here. I reset the battle until I landed Bane's Venom on the first enemy turn 1, and then I just healed repeatedly until it died to it. Once there was only one enemy left, it was easier to manage, so I hit it with the Venom as well, and then used heals and regular attacks until it went down. The next floor boss was a lot harder. The 3 enemies together could actually do so much damage that they could take Jenna out from full HP in a single turn. Eventually, the strategy I came up with was to use the tier 4 Earth Summon turn 1 and the tier 4 Fire Summon turn 2. If I got lucky, and the enemies didn't deal too much damage, this would take out both of the smaller enemies, and Jenna could tank one more hit from the remaining big one. Once the big one was alone, my plan was to hit it with Bane to poison it, but the poison never actually landed. The boss also managed to poison Jenna a few times, so I had to waste several turns using the Tonic Djinn while keeping her healed up. I never did manage to poison it with Bane, but I did manage to defeat it by just smacking it over the head with Bane enough times. On this floor, I finally grabbed the Cleric's Ring, and then equipped it and the Thunder Crown. With that, Jenna now had the equipment she'd be taking to the end of the game. The next floor boss was much easier, and I actually beat it on my very first try. And with that, I had fought my way down to the bottom floor. I fought the Mimic, left the dungeon, revived everyone, recovered their Djinn, killed them off again, and then came back. The boss down here is Deadbeard, the game's super boss. I couldn't gimmick my way to a win with Bane because he's immune to its poison effect, but I had an idea on how to deal with this guy. Other than his regular attack and defend, every single move he has is Synergy, and costs PP. So, if I just stalled until he ran out of PP, he'd be limited to the regular attack and defend. But he hits like a truck, and surviving his attacks was too difficult. So it was back to the grind. But because Jenna was so thoroughly outclassed, it was clear that I couldn't just gain an extra level or two and edge this out. So I got to work, and got Jenna from level 32 all the way up to level 38. This took an absolutely disgusting amount of time to do. I maxed out my money, maxed out on potions across all 4 characters' inventories. For several days straight I'd sit down to do a Golden Sun session, and just kill this lizard the entire time. But I wasn't done preparing yet. After Jenna reached level 38, I went all the way back to Mogul Forest, my very first grinding spot, and fought the enemies there again until I had 30 vials. Given that Jenna's max HP was still less than 500, I figured having 30 potions and 30 vials on her, so that she had 60 items that would heal her to full, would give me a much better chance of success. And finally, I did a bit of research, and found that other people who'd done solo challenges with other characters, and attempted the same stall strategy, used a piece of equipment called the Guardian Armlet. It was weaker than my current stuff, but if you use it as an item, it lets you buff a character's defense by 25%, and you can stack it for a 50% boost. It's another item you can win from the fountain in Tolby. I tried the fight without doing the routing strategy at first, just to see, and it was quickly clear that I needed it here. Deadbeard could buff his attack, and if he did that and then did 2 regular attacks, he defeated Jenna instantly, because each attack did over 240 damage. So I decided to use the routing strategy. Being able to anticipate his attacks made a huge difference. On a turn where he was going to defeat Jenna with 2 buffed attacks, I used the Flash Djinn to block the damage. And when he ran out of PP, and started spamming attacks twice per turn, I was able to use the Guardian Armlet to buff Jenna's defense on a turn where I knew Deadbeard was going to use one of his actions to defend so Jenna could survive the turn. Once I made it to that point and buffed Jenna's defense as much as possible, I made sure to keep the defense buff active, by using the armlet on turns where it was still active, like with Breeze back in the Saturos battle. I waited until Deadbeard's resistance buffs went away, and then used summons. Once I'd used all of them, besides water summons since he's resistant against water, I started using the Bane Djinn, the Vine Djinn, and then doing the tier 2 Earth summon. He's weak to Earth, so repeatedly doing the tier 2 summon let me keep a good stream of damage going. Since Jenna's defense was buffed, she didn't need all of the Jin active to survive anymore. At that point, I just kept the defense buff up, kept Jenna's HP healed, and used the 2 Jin and then the summon over and over. I also used a water summon to defeat him once his HP was just low enough. And as my hard-earned reward, I got the Demon Mail, a cursed piece of armor that Jenna can't even equip. And with that, I was finally done with Crossbone Isle. Many hours and many levels later. You know the drill by now. I left, revived the group, recovered their Jin, killed them in the desert, backtracked to Mogul Forest to replenish Jenna's supply of vials, and then headed back. All that was left now was the final dungeon. Almost. I almost forgot about this, but for convenience, I had just been skipping the boss fight with the tornado lizard that chases you in the desert I mentioned earlier. But if I was going out of my way to take down the game's super boss, then I felt like I should beat this thing too. Now, what is this thing? Well, it's basically just a weaker version of the lizard I'd farmed on Crossbone Isle. And now all that was left was the final dungeon. After puzzling my way through, I reached the top for the final boss fight. This is a 2-part battle. You fight Saturos and Minardi, and then once you beat them, they merge into the fusion dragon and you fight that. The Saturos and Minardi battle is a weird one. They do a lot of damage, but honestly that wasn't the biggest issue. The problem was that Minardi has a move called Death Size, which has a chance to instantly kill a character no questions asked. No matter how promising an attempt looked, since Jenna was alone, as soon as this move succeeded the run died right there. So after trying for a few hours, I decided that I had to route this one too, because Death Size always eventually seemed to work. Looking at other solo runs on YouTube, the big difference was that since all the other characters have access to classes and abilities, they've all got ways to deal consistent damage, and the HP and stats to tank more hits between heals. That means they can stay on the offensive, and take Minardi down faster. Since I had to spend so much time healing and using Jin, I wasn't really on the offensive very much at all, which meant Minardi had all the time in the world to fire off a Death Size that succeeded. Minardi was faster than Jenna with my current setup, so I set my Jin up like this, so that I could use all 3 water Jin, and Jenna would still be faster. My strategy was to use all the summons I could, and then transition into using my water Jin and the water summon. This ended up working perfectly, and I also got Jenna's HP to a good amount before dealing the finishing blow. Saturos and Minardi merged into the Fusion Dragon, and as kind of a fun conclusion to the glitchiness of the playthrough, Jenna was a giant in the final battle. Usually the characters are tiny next to the dragon, but the developers achieved that by creating an actual set of small versions of each character's sprites. Since Jenna is never supposed to be in the party here, they didn't create ones for her, and so it just uses her regular sprites, which makes her massive here. Now, I did route this fight out, but I'm not gonna bother explaining it. Why? Well, after creating my route through both fights, I sat down to record the full, clean run-through of the battles, and I lost to Saturos and Minardi. I tried it again, thinking I just made some kind of mistake, and I lost again. I thought at first that maybe I just made a mistake in writing down my route, but I also noticed that things were different across attempts. For example, although they always used the same moves, they'd sometimes deal different amounts of damage, so the RNG obviously wasn't as consistent as it always had been. I was pretty baffled, and didn't really know what to do besides throw myself at the battle over and over and hope it worked. But it didn't. This was pretty annoying, because routing out these fights genuinely took multiple hours. So I turned to the speedrun community again, curious whether the RNG for this fight worked differently or something. And the answer I got was that no, the RNG for this fight should be consistent. At first, I was told that the Saturos and Minardi fight was consistent, but the Fusion Dragon fight wouldn't be, because the GRN, responsible for things like who an enemy targets, advances in the cutscene between the fights. Also, I learned that if you skip a summon animation, that can affect the GRN too. But when I explained I was doing a solo run, I was told that only the GRN should be affected by this. So in a solo run, where there was only one possible character to target in my party, these things shouldn't matter. So then what was the problem? Well, after looking more closely at my failed attempts, I noticed they always used the same moves, but Minardi would cast Impact twice to raise attack power, and while she would often cast both on Saturos, sometimes she'd cast one on herself, which led to them dealing different damage. Plexa explained that this was the problem. Although Jenna was solo, since there were 2 enemies with a move that could target one of the 2, mashing through the summon animations to skip them actually caused the RNG to become inconsistent for who got targeted with Impact, which eventually led to things falling apart. And sure enough, when I thought back, every previous boss I'd used the routing strategy on had been on their own. In a 1v1 fight, there's no randomness in who gets targeted. So for the entire game, I'd been mashing through the summoning animations, and unknowingly messing with the RNG responsible for who enemies target the entire time. But it never ended up having an effect, because they only ever had 2 targets, themselves for buffs, and Jenna for attacks. So, all I had to do to make this consistent was to let summoning animations play out in their entirety. With renewed hope, I strapped back in to route the fights out again. The Saturos and Minardi fight ended up being fairly similar to my first attempt, though I managed to optimize my item usage. And the Fusion Dragon fight. Like I mentioned, this fight is normally impossible to route. So in a strange twist, after an entire playthrough with Jenna being by herself had put her at a disadvantage, the Fusion Dragon fight was only possible to route because she was alone, which meant she was the only possible target, and the RNG would be consistent as a result. This fight was a much stiffer challenge at 5000 HP. The approach was primarily to go for summons. Since I'd used up all of my summons but Jupiter against Saturos and Minardi, I opened the battle with that for a little blast of damage, and then started using the water gin Jenna had on her, and followed them with a summon. Of course, healing often in between. The boss could move twice per turn, and could deal a lot of damage, so I had to spend a lot of turns healing. Thanks to all my farming though, I had plenty of vials and potions to work with, and to conserve them, I'd also occasionally use nuts when they gave me enough of a heal. The tier 2 water summon did close to 400 damage, and the tier 3 one did close to 600, so they were my best sources of offense. Another thing I took advantage of on occasion was Jenna's regular attack. With the Swift Sword's Unleash effect, Jenna could occasionally do regular attacks that dealt around 225 damage. So that was basically the technique. Focus on summons, and occasionally throw in a regular attack. The boss could inflict Jenna with Venom, which did a lot of damage, so sometimes I'd have to use the Tonic Gin to cure that, or summon at tier 2 instead of tier 3 so Tonic could recover. The dragon has a move it occasionally uses called Drain Fang, where it attacks Jenna and restores that amount of HP. And I guess I must have missed writing some of those down, because when I thought the boss was one attack away from death, it didn't die. But once it was close to dying, I decided that I wanted to finish it with a regular attack from Jenna, for style points I guess, to let the character who should never even be here claim the victory by her own hand. So I actually ended up extending the battle by several turns, even when a summon would have finished it, so I could win it with an attack from Jenna. Writing down the route for these two fights over the course of hours, and then sitting down and recording the full run-through, was incredibly nerve-wracking, because I knew that if I made a single mistake in my writing, or if I made a single wrong selection, then I'd have to do the entire thing all over again. But on turn 91, an attack from Jenna finally brought the final battle to a close. And with that, the adventure was over. You can indeed beat Golden Sun using only Jenna, the character you can only get through glitches. The party, having been unconscious for the entire fight and completely unaware of what just happened, sets off to find Jenna, forgetting that she was chilling in Isaac's pocket. Isaac obtains an orb to pilot a ship to help them find Jenna, gives it to Jenna, and the party sets off for the next game. Often at the end of these videos, I'll say whether or not I recommend trying the challenge, and I'm usually able to give it a solid yes, it's fun, or no, it's annoying. But I came away from this particular challenge feeling more conflicted than any of my previous ones. The early parts of the game are genuinely great fun, some of my most memorable moments from any playthrough of this game. Having a limited number of resources, and trying to pool together what you can, and slowly clawing your way to new helpful features, is a lot of fun. But as the playthrough goes on, the solution to problems seems to become level grinding and routing more and more, which kind of starts to become tedious. So if you're a fan of this game, I say that if you're interested in trying this, just play until you find it stops being fun, and I think you'll come away from it with a super unique experience. Probably don't go as far with it as I did. I hope you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.